In this video, we're going to talk about what the church does. And what's going to be a bit of a difficulty for you is that I'm going to give you kind of general principles that the church does, general things. And you're going to maybe scratch your head a little bit and go, but when I come to church, I don't see the connection between that and what we're doing on a regular basis. We're actually going to discuss that in class because that's an important thing. And I'm going to give you a little hint here to think about before you get to class. Some of the things that you're seeing in church being done are these principles played out in a certain way. What I'm saying is there's a value system behind and a point behind and a purpose behind some of the things you see done, but you're like, where did the Bible tell us to have, a softball event? Well, it doesn't. So I want you to be thinking, you're smart people. What is the point behind the softball event? It's not to play softball. So what is it, and where do I see the point line up with what we have here? There's other things you'll see in church that maybe aren't doing a good job of being these things. That maybe it might become, to continue the example, just a softball event. And so that's where we go, wait a minute, why are we doing this? And the church actually is constantly asking itself, why are we doing this? Is this the best thing to be doing? Is this what we should be doing? Does this get us to those biblical teachings? The other thing that can be a little bit difficult is you might either it's possible in this class that you're familiar with other churches and other church practices, or that in the future you'll see other churches with very different practices. And so we're gonna open the video kind of talking about that idea of practices, but it can be really confusing when you see very different churches doing very different things and going, wait a minute, how is this all part of the same thing? Are these just, which one's right? And it's not really as simple as that, and we'll get to why. When we go to the Bible actually gives us very little of what the church is supposed to do. It gives us some, but it doesn't really give us a lot of these really specific details that we might like. And so what we're looking at in the Bible when it talks about the church activity is it often gives principles and not practices. And so what it might give us is something like in Hebrew, the book of Hebrews, it says, don't forsake the fellowshipping together of yourselves. Okay. So what does that mean? What does that look like? Does that mean we need to meet more than weekly, less than weekly? Do we need small groups? You see how quickly you're like, okay, how do we play that out? And it's going to play out differently in different cultures with different needs. So I think that's the brilliance, or we would say the Bible is divinely inspired, that God, this is God's word, that it's not so rigid and put into just these really specific things, because it's going to need to go to, God always knew it would go to different cultures, and when it goes to different cultures, it's going to need to change the format a little bit. Let me give you what is kind of my easiest go-to example of this idea. In the Bible, there's a place that talks about women should pray with their hair covered. And there are a couple approaches to this. One is to say, oh, that sounds really oppressive. Why do they have to cover up? Is the church ashamed of its women? Another practice, if you ever go to, I don't know, ever is probably not a good word, but some Orthodox churches, I remember when I went to Ukraine, and they had little scarves if you didn't have one, and the ladies with us had to put a little scarf over their head to enter into an Orthodox church in Ukraine. So that Orthodox practice is to say, this is the original Bible practice, we need to continue that practice. The extreme opposite is the Bible is wrong because it's making women cover their hair. When we do a little digging and we understand what the Bible is saying at its time, covering the hair meant something and uncovering the hair meant something. And really to uncover your hair was to be immodest, especially in church and in public. In a way, it was to disrespect your husband. It was a little bit like taking off your wedding ring in public. Um, it was something that in some areas was actually so immodest that it was almost a sign of prostitution. And so when we understand that, we go, oh, okay, we're talking about respect and modesty in public. Okay, what does respect and modesty in public then look like in my culture? Because, by the way, modesty looks very different in different cultures. And so the principle is respect and modesty, not covering the hair. That's a practice. So we go, okay, what practice would work for me now, or what fits into our culture? I hope that makes sense, because it's not about all the specific practices. It's about the principles. However, there are a few practices that the Bible does tell us that we are to do. There are two main ones that we call sacraments. If you're from the Catholic Church, you had 7 sacraments. The Protestant Church has 2. If you're really curious about why, I could get into that with you, maybe offline. I don't know that it's worth all the video time on that. But we practice baptism and we practice communion. Baptism, you may have been baptized, or this may be the exciting year for you where you get baptized. There'll be one coming up. Baptism is the symbol of our old self dying with Christ on the cross, like as though it's nailed to the cross with him. And then we come out of the water, so we go down into the water and then come back out of the water. The coming back out of the water symbolizes our new life, rising again, new life now, and one day after we die, eternal new life with Jesus, with God. That's baptism. It's a public declaration of your faith in Jesus. We also practice communion, which is sometimes called the Lord's Supper. And we take a little piece of bread, and you've probably, at this point, if you've been here, you may have seen this done. You may have seen it done on movies. This, again, is a practice. The specifics of this practice are done different ways by different churches. But in general, it's the same practice. We take a little piece of bread. If you've noticed the bread is really crunchy and hard and seems like a stale cracker, there's a reason for that. That bread is called unleavened bread. It doesn't have this yeasty ingredient that makes bread expand and be soft and lovely. In the Old Testament of the Bible, leaven, that agent in the bread, was a symbol of sin, as sin spreads and spreads and spreads. This bread is without that leaven. So yes, it's a little bit harder, a little bit tougher, but it doesn't, the picture is that it's sinless. Jesus said this bread is a picture of his body that was blessed and broken for us. So he broke this bread, he gave it to his disciples the night before he died. And he said, as often as you do this in remembrance of me. So we do that part, and I gave you a little description of what that is there. Same with the cup of juice or wine. So traditionally it's wine. We use juice. The reason for that is that there's a lot of people in our church, in the Protestant church, for whom alcohol is something that they've kind of maybe sworn off, maybe come out of a personal abuse of alcohol, a family that has abused alcohol. That doesn't mean that alcohol is wrong, but we have a phrase in church. We don't want to stumble anybody. So it's the idea of, remember I said we're all running a race? We're all running a race. And so if you just like stuck a thing in front of somebody next to you, like, in the cartoons, like, I don't know, Wile E. Coyote or something, you just like stuck boom, and they fall. We don't want to put things in people's path that are going to make them not be able to run their race well. That's the idea. I gave you again the description of what that is. It's a little technical, but really what you're doing is you're saying that I accept again, I remember again the sacrifice of Jesus pouring his blood out for me. And Jesus said that this is a seal of a covenant, meaning it's an agreement. So it's sort of like saying, okay, I remember again, Jesus has made this perfect agreement with me that he will be faithful and I will have faith in him. He will always be trustworthy, and I will put my trust in him. He will take away my sin, and I will give my life to him. And so it's this agreement, and he's saying this is like you all again, just remembering that agreement that we have. This is it again and again. There are other practices in the Bible that are again a little bit general, but for instance, being taught the Bible, serving one another, having fellowship together. These are described especially in one particular verse, Acts 2:42. These are not all the practices. For instance, singing is not listed there, but we know that Jesus even sang a hymn at that same Last Supper before he died with his followers. He sang a hymn. We don't know what hymn. I don't think like our hymns today that are from the 17 and 1800s. Nevertheless, it would have been something probably from Psalms. Nevertheless, we get some particular practices there, prayer together, but it doesn't tell us all the details of how to pray, how to have fellowship, all of what the teaching should be. Those can be different for different churches and different cultures. You have a list there of what makes a healthy church. Take a look. I won't go through those on the video, but take a look and see if you have questions about any of those. Same with this list of the quote-unquote one another's. There's some things in the Bible that it says that we should do to one another. The only one I want to highlight is confess to there at the bottom. The other ones I feel like are, well, maybe they're not self-explanatory. So let me also talk about what bearing burdens means. Confess to one another means that we would tell each other, and I would say it this way: find a trusted, godly person who in confidence you can go to and say, this is where my heart is, or this is what I've been doing. Can you pray for me? And can you help check in on me? Because this is a problem in my life. We all have problems in our life. Where some churches you would confess to a priest, the Bible actually says you can confess your sins one to another. There is something so powerful and so beautiful in this process. I've had many people confess things to me, and I've confessed things to others, and I found men in my life, so it should be same gender, men in my life that I can trust. Why same gender? Because when you get really vulnerable sometimes with somebody of the opposite gender, that can lead us down a road to temptation. Also, that person may not understand the way that we operate the same. And so, I have especially one person in particular that I can go to and just share, here's where I'm at, please pray with me. And it's never a thing of judgment and, you're the worst, Andrew, you're just terrible. It's accountability, and we'll talk about that at the end. But it really is a beautiful, powerful thing. Also, where it says bear burdens, the context there is if somebody really is that they're really struggling with a sin. We use that word struggle a lot. They're wrestling, they're fighting, they don't want to do it, but they keep doing it. It's just like really messing up their life. That we're to rally around them and help them move forward with that. Again, how does that look? Well, one way it looks in our church is counseling. Another way is our Celebrate Recovery group. It can be just more casual than that. It could just be people talking with and praying with and checking in with, and maybe even giving guidance to, right? And so we bear one another's burdens. When we talk about there being not just one simple practice, that gets us into the idea of variety. So different churches will do different things well. Maybe church A does really well with homeless outreach, and church B does really well with missions, and church C does really well with youth and children. And every church might be doing all of these things in part, but one might really stand out. That's okay. That's a good thing, and we can learn from one another. Likewise, in the church, different individuals in the church are good at different things, are passionate about different things, are just wired for different things. I have substituted in several times when the children's ministry really needed somebody. Disaster every time. I'm no good at it. I'm not great with little kids. I don't know what it is. Until you get to like junior high, I don't know how to even like deal with you. There are other people who are just great at that and used to say, I can't believe you would spend any time with junior high kids. They're the worst. I'm like, they're the best. But their gifting was with younger kids. There are people who are really into like having people over to their house and just fellowship and let's have dinner and let's eat. There are other people who are really good at maybe teaching, or there are people who are really good at just serving needs and helping people who are in distress. We're going to talk a little bit in class about if you've identified any of those things in yourself. And then this one's pretty funky. This one's going to be maybe tougher for you. Maybe not. I don't know. But on page 5, I talk about what we call spiritual gifts. Spiritual gifts, to put it in a short way, are special, supernatural abilities that we are given mainly to serve the church, but it could also be to serve the world. But abilities were given for the good of others, but were given them by God. And I give you a little chart here because there's a difference between what I'm talking about and just like a skill. So a skill is something that you can just learn, like playing the piano. The example I give there is speaking French. You can learn to speak French. It might take you longer. It might be easier. That's not the point. You learn to do it. It's a learned skill. Abilities are a little more like just general talent. So let's say you just have a general ability. You're kind of good with language, let's say. So you have an ability for language. A natural gift or a strength is a little more general than that. And that might be that you're just a good learner. You've been a good student. You're a good learner. Okay. These are just examples. All of those under that dotted line there on page 5, all of those could apply to any person. They don't need to be indwelt by the Holy Spirit. They don't need to be a believer following Jesus. But above that line is spiritual gifts. And spiritual gifts are gifts that are abilities that only God gives, such as, if we're talking about language, speaking in tongues, which you may or may not have heard of, and many people have kind of made a weird thing. But essentially how I would define that is being able to pray to God or speak to others in a language that you haven't learned and you don't even fully understand. It's very weird to describe, but it's something that some people have a special, like their soul is like moved and they pray to God in a language they don't even understand. And you're like, that's weird. I'm out. I'm done with Fresh Faith class. That's too strange for me. Let me give you one thing to think about as we get to this point. And I want you to think back to the lesson on God, lesson 3. We talked about if God fits into our brain and he fits into our box, that's not God anymore. God is bigger than we can understand, but we can know him. Remember what we kept saying? We can't understand him, but we can know him. This is an example of that. The Lord will give you abilities that you don't fully understand, but you know it's from the Lord. You don't fully understand how it works, and it might even be scary and freaky deaky. Hey, it might even be exciting, but really it's bigger than you. It's from the Lord. There are lots of ones of these described in the Bible. I'm not going to go through all of them because they have little descriptions there on page 5 and 6. Some of them may sound more natural and some may sound more supernatural, but all of these are God-given abilities used for the good of others, especially in the church. We can talk more about this, and I want you to look at yourself and go, do any of those describe me? What would others say? Would others say that I have this gift or that gift? I'd be happy to talk more about any of these with you. I know this is a really confusing and kind of weird topic, so I'd be happy to talk more if you have questions. But we're actually in class, we're actually going to pray that you receive what God has for you. This is something that I pray for people when I baptize them, that God would give them whatever abilities that he has for them. But I want you to remember, it's not only, let me put it this way. God uses our practical abilities, and there's people in the Bible that he will say, I'm going to use this person's skill. There's 2 guys in the Old Testament named Bezalel and Aholiab, which are great names. Name your kids those names, Bezalel and Aholiab. And these 2 guys, God says, I want them to make this this structure for me, this tent where you guys are going to pray to me. I want them to make it because they're the best craftsmen. So God uses our skill in that way. God also gives us spiritual abilities that are maybe seem less practical, but it's not as simple as that. It's on the spectrum of practical spiritual. The Bible's always pushing those two things together, not separating them out. And so some of these, again, it's going to be hard sometimes to find the line, but what is practical and what is spiritual? A great example, and I'll move on from here. Administration there at the bottom says the ability to bring order to God's work. That doesn't necessarily mean that you live your life at Office Depot and you buy a lot of sticky notes and you have binders for everything. That might be a good administrator, but spiritual administration is the ability to plan and mold and see what God is doing and join in that and be able to bring order into things and bring God's way into things. I've known many missionaries who are terrible at administrating the way we think of it with sticky notes and emails and responses. That's not their gift, but they're able to say, this is the plan that we have for what God is doing here, where we live with the people we're sharing the gospel with and trying to help. And they can come up with an amazing plan I don't think I would ever come up with, but they're never going to go to Office Depot to share the plan in an email package with me. I hope that kind of makes sense. It's a spiritual planning. So some of these are kind of spiritual and kind of practical. That's kind of the point. It's spiritual in its source, but it's practical in its outcome. All right, let's talk a little bit about ministry. Ministry is a word that we're going to use a lot in church, but it basically means to serve. And we'll talk about different ministries here. Oh, we have men's ministry, women's ministry, children's ministry. What that means is those are designed to serve the needs of those people, okay? They're designed to go, okay, specifically, what do junior hires need? Specifically, what does a kindergartner need? How do we meet those different needs? I like this quote here by James Boyce. He says, "Basic to Christian life, whether of leaders or of other Christians, is service. To be a Christian is to minister, and that means to serve." Being part of the church, hear me on this, being part of the church means that you find a way to serve. That does not mean that we have a whole process where if you want to be an ongoing volunteer in a particular ministry and represent us and all of that, that's great, and you may go that way, and that's awesome. But it might be more low key than that, where you're finding a way to serve those around you, to pray for those, to ask what they need, to see needs and meet them, to give, to help lead and disciple maybe somebody. We're talking about that one next week. Doesn't really matter what it is so much, but the point is that we all serve. It's not just that we pay people like me to have an office here so that we can serve everybody. Now, there's a place for that, and we do that, and not everybody can be here all day, and so we do pay representatives to do that. I understand that, but we all have a part, and we all want to serve in some part. All right. Worship. I include worship here because worship is really part of what the church does. And really, if we were to define worship, worship is all that the church does. All that the church does to glorify God, to show how wonderful God is. I sometimes define worship in a short way, and I did in a previous video, as enjoying God and letting Him know. Enjoying God and letting Him know. So there are different ways to worship. We sometimes think of, and we talk about here, worship as a time in a church service where we are singing together. That's a form of worship, but that's not the only form of worship. So there's a list here at the bottom of page 7 on ways that we can worship. Enjoyment, obedience, singing, service, giving, learning, prayer. There are lots of ways to worship. Enjoyment might be the most striking one on there because it doesn't seem like something that, is holy enough because we're not doing and sacrificing something. Enjoyment might be one of the most direct ways to worship, because if worship is enjoying God and letting Him know, I honestly, and I'm not kidding here. Oh, and that verse there is Nehemiah 8, and basically what they're told, these people are told to do at a certain point where they're really feeling bad because they haven't been obeying God well enough, and they're like, God, please forgive us. The priests there that represent God to them tell them, okay, at this point, I want you to go and find something really good and fatty to eat, and find something really sweet to drink, and then share it with others. Go and enjoy what God has given you, and enjoy it together in community. That's worship as well. That might be the most That might be the best definition of worship. Enjoy God. And then we also let him know, and we let him know through some of those other ways that are on there, and we help share with people, for instance, through service and giving on there. So maybe one of those is striking. Think about if you could try to find something that fits one of those categories that would help you this week to expand how you worship God. On page 8, I have how the church grows together. And we have obviously several things. My point is that we don't just grow alone. We don't grow well alone. And some people, they either come to church and never attach to anything or any person, or they read their Bible at home and pray at home and never involve themselves in a church. And those are not good ways to grow. We grow together. You can read through these. Accountability is one that I mentioned several times, so I'm going to mention that here. Accountability there says, we find healing as the church speaks truth in love. Accountability is allowing people to confront things in our life they see that are not us following Jesus. We should do that in love. We should do that in a place of trust. But it's good and right for us to be able to say, hey, this is not what's best for you, and this is not what's best for the church, and this is not following Jesus. Oftentimes how this looks is people enter into a kind of agreement with each other of, hey, can you keep me accountable? Yeah, can you keep me accountable? And we check in. Hey, how's that going? Hey, how can I be praying for you? Hey, what can we do to move forward from living in this trap? So I can describe that more if you're interested in hearing more about that. But all of those things, reflection, accountability, learning, opportunity, and identity, are ways that I would describe how the church grows together as a family. And then we'll talk about this a little bit more next week, or last week actually, but the mission of the church. When Jesus was about to leave the earth, he gave one last commandment, one last purpose statement, one last mission, however you want to look at it, to his followers. And he told them, in essence, what he told them was, take this message of me and go out and teach others to be followers of me as well. Take it to every nation, every group of people, and teach them to follow me as well. I'm not going to belabor this. As I said, we will talk about this next week, along with the idea of discipleship. But Jesus told us to take the message of Jesus to others. We call this sometimes evangelism. Evangelism comes from the Greek word for gospel. Gospel means good news. All these words kind of mean the same. They're all in the same little family there, the little category there of, we tell people the good news about Jesus and his salvation, that we can live with him forever, that we can have new life in him, new fellowship with his church under his authority in his good kingdom. And so our mission is to take that out. So everything that we do, I had somebody describe it to me this way. The best picture of the church is an aircraft carrier, where we all serve this purpose to launch airplanes, or launch the gospel out, or launch people who are taking the gospel out. That doesn't mean that we all are the launchees. It doesn't mean that we all are pilots on the aircraft carrier, but we all have a part in what's going on in order to make that process happen, to make the gospel go out into more and more lives. You're going to get a homework assignment, which I will explain in class and not here. And then you have your memory verse. I don't know if you've been looking at those or doing those. Memory verses are awesome. I still try to memorize scripture. It's tough. I'm actually not super great at it. But really, a good practice to be memorizing these. You would have 7 verses if you memorized each one in this class, so that you have a little basis on each of these topics. You have one verse that's kind of a go-to of, I know one verse about that particular topic. You'll find that you have got quite a lot memorized then, if you even memorized those 7. All right, I will see you in class. Have a great week.